Yeah, it seems to be.
But what I mean by the hard cases is that when you do see a dramatic increase in white supremacist incidents on campuses, university administrators have to pay attention. And particularly when there are people who come from the outside, and the university president has a hard time keeping control of her or his campus. But that's a different situation from Mr. Carolla.
Mr. Shapiro, you an agitator?
Not as far as I'm aware. So I think that some of what's been said does mini-skirt the debate. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I got it right. When you were talking about the Wisconsin law, I believe that law was brought up in direct counter to what happened, and it was people talked about it on the floor of the legislature. In direct counter to what happened when I spoke at University of Wisconsin at Madison, where you had a bunch of protesters who stood in front of the stage and obstructed the stage, and then refused to leave. And when I asked the police would they remove the protesters they've been going for 15 minutes. By the way. Personally, two things, just to preface. I have no problem whatsoever with people protesting my speeches. I do have a problem with people who won't actually let me speak. And number two, as far as all the talk about white supremacy, I can speak from experience. Mr. Lawrence, your organization named me the #1 target of anti-Semitism online last year. So I have a trophy at my house that #1 hated Jew in America. So I'm totally familiar with the level of vitriol that's become common in our politics. But one of the things that's a problem, and I think we have to be careful about, is when we say leave it to the administrators, and then the administrators do what they did at UW, which is the police. I said to the police, "Will you remove these protesters?" And the police said, "We have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters, we are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters." We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in free speech designed to enrich the debate, but in order to shut down the debate. And there have to be some sort of ramifications for people who are actually committing trespass. I mean, this is not a question of everyone is trying to focus in on this term hate crime and hate speech. But the important part of those phrases is not the first word. It's speech versus crime. So if there's a crime that's being committed, we're all in agreement. If somebody commits a crime and they're speaking of an imminent threat to somebody, of course that's a crime. But that has very little to do with the hate and a lot more to do with the crime as to whether that's prosecuted, because hate speech is not prosecutable, nor should it be policed by the campus. So the fact is that what we are seeing is a conflation between speech and active attempts to obstruct in order to promote the obstruction by some administrators on a few college campuses.
Mr. Shapiro, proponents of curtailed speech often argue that certain types of speech amount to violence, noting that certain listeners are emotionally harmed when listening to ideas with which they disagree. There was an article in the LA Times that made this argument, going so far as to call on courts and legislatures to allow the restriction of hate speech as do all other economically advanced democracies in the world. Is there any limiting principle at play where forbidden speech is anything that a particular person or group of people find offensive?
No, I haven't seen any limiting principle at play at all on college campuses, which is the problem. You'll have people like Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal treated exactly the same way as Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos, and they're poles apart in terms of how they express themselves and many of the views that they hold. So this idea that there is some sort of bright line, this is why I hate even the term hate speech is really difficult, because it just suggests that if I don't like what you're saying, or if I impute to you an intent that you may not have, then now you're hateful and you should be banned. It seems to me that it would a more effective use of terminology would say speech I find insulting or speech I find offensive. But the idea of hate speech itself, there are certain types of speech I think we can all agree are objectively hateful, but I don't think that there is any limiting principle at play from a lot of administrators, because I think that they use that club of hate speech in order to cudgel people with whom they disagree. They just say, okay, I don't like what you're saying now, and that's hate speech. And microaggression culture contributes to this. I mean, literally on campuses, students will be told that if you say to another student, where are you from, that this is some sort of microaggression, that this is a minor form of hate speech. If you say, where are you from, because you're implying they're not from here. Well, I mean, of course you're not from here. I mean, I assume you weren't born on this spot, but it doesn't matter. You know, the idea that you're going to broaden out terminology in order to prohibit groups that you don't like or ideas that you don't like, I would much prefer that if we're going to move the ratchet in any one direction, let's move the ratchet in favor of more speech. And I agree, of course, with Mr. Lawrence that it's perfectly appropriate if an administrator wants to say that I personally disagree, the university doesn't agree with the views that are being espoused by a particular speaker. That's perfectly appropriate. But sometimes there are gray areas in terms of what the university is doing. When Mr. Lawrence was at Brandeis University, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was uninvited from the university because of blowback from some of the students. I mean, is that a case of her free speech rights being violated? It's a private university, but if it were a public university, would that be a case of her free speech rights being violated because administrators decided not to stand up for those because students were upset? I mean, this is why I think that the notion that there is some sort of grand intelligentsia running the universities who are capable of discriminating between hate speech and normal speech and should be sitting atop a hill somewhere under a palm tree like a Qadi dispensing justice on a case-by-case basis, I think it's nonsense, and I don't think that they have any rational standards they apply.
Mr. Shapiro, I'm going to assume you don't find this to be a threatening or harmful document.
I've brandished it at a few people myself, yeah.
Look, the college's defense when they arrested these students, by the way, they spent overnight in jail, 7 hours in jail for handing out constitutions. You said something earlier that struck me, that time, place, and manner regulations are being used to restrict free speech, because that's what the college said to these students who belong to Young Americans for Liberty. They said if you just filled out the paperwork, if you'd stood 100 feet over there instead of where you're standing, and if you'd done it at this time, we would have allowed you to hand out our nation's founding document. Can you speak to how time, manner, and place restrictions are being abused?
So most obviously, UC Berkeley did that with Ann Coulter, where they kept moving around her room and they kept saying they didn't have rooms available. They said the same thing to me a week ago. There was some public outcry, and now they're offering some rooms, which I hope that event goes forward. It's not rare. They do this a lot. A private university that did it was DePaul University. I was threatened with arrest if I set foot on campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for ideological discrimination, because if Ta-Nehisi Coates wants to speak on these campuses, there's not going to be any problem. The administrators will make certain that time, place, and manner restrictions don't get in the way. And this is why I say, saying that the discretion of administrators is wonderful is all well and good, except that they very often are attempting to achieve a particular political end by using means that are normally legitimate, and it's happened in the past. But when you teach a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old people this, you shouldn't be surprised when, number one, they go into hiding with their viewpoint, or number two, they become frustrated. It's an absurdity to suggest that you can tell people that their viewpoints are out of line because of their identity. At the same time, you're telling other people that their viewpoints are completely in line because of their identity, and that any assault on their senses must be protected or prevented at any cost.
Now, it's interesting, Mr. Shapiro, you talked about white privilege. And just this week, I had a conversation with Rachel Lazar, who's done some work, a Jewish American woman who's done some work on this area, as well as having extensive conversations with Dr. Greg Parks of Wake Forest University, who's also talked quite a bit about critical race theory. And it's my understanding that white privilege is not telling individuals that they cannot speak, but it is a term for societal privilege that individuals have as a benefit of their white skin. And I don't think that, and I think universities would be remiss to then say that because you're white, you're not allowed to say anything that's critical of white people. I didn't know that white privilege actually went into that sphere. My understanding is it's just, and the issue is that white privilege makes people uncomfortable to talk about the societal privilege that they have.
Well, to me, what I say on campuses all the time is if you want to cite instances of racism that we can all find and fight together, that's something that I'm more than willing to stand next to you and fight, because that's obviously stuff that we should fight together. But when you just say that there is a white privilege out there in the ether and that by dint of birth your skin color generates for you an advantage, what you're really saying to people is that your view is less valuable because you have not experienced what I've experienced. And that is an identity argument, that's a character argument, that's not a rational political argument that can actually be taken on in any way. It's more of a cudgel and a club than it is an attempt to open